Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another computer science lecture. Today we are going to discuss the last part of section 3 of the new syllabus, that is networking hardware. The first thing which we have in this section is the network interface card, or this is more commonly known as the LAN card. A network interface card, or NIC for short, is an electronic circuit or a chip. It can be either a chip, or it can be a circuit board, or it can be an expansion card. Okay, expansion card is a piece of hardware circuit board that you can add to your desktop PC inside the desktop PC through special slots which are available on the motherboard. Okay, it may be an expansion card, or it may be a chip that allows a device to connect to a network or to internet. It can be internal or external, means it may be you having a USB connectivity, or it may be embedded internally, like in your laptops, your NICs are usually embedded inside the laptop or notebook, and then you can use it to connect to a Wi-Fi network. It can also be wired or wireless, means Wi-Fi. There can be two types of NICs. One can be a wired, means you have to connect a cable net or some other wire to it in order for the internet to work, or it may be wireless for like your handheld devices or mobile phones. You can simply use a Wi-Fi connection to connect to the internet. The NIC contains the actual MAC address or media access control address that is used over the internet to identify your device. That this address is embedded into the NIC at the manufacturing stage. NICs which use wireless technology are called wireless network interface cards or controllers, WNIC for short. Now here are a few examples of NICs. This is an NIC that can be embedded inside a computer, a desktop computer, through the help of expansion slots on the motherboard. This is an example of USB wireless interface card. This is also known as TP-Link USB, or it may be of Tenda. This is an example of wireless NIC card that can be installed inside a desktop, and this is an example of USB LAN card or USB NIC. You can connect this part to the USB port, and then you can connect the wire of the LAN or network through this LAN port. This is a LAN port. This is the type of connection on a device through which you can simply install a cable net wire and or the wire of your modem and connect your internet. This is the back side of a router, and as you can see, routers usually have 4 or 5 LAN ports. Again, see, this is a LAN wire or a networking wire, and it is embedded inside this LAN port or networking. Now the next thing in this section is media access control address, or MAC address for short. Now whenever the examiner asks you what is a MAC address, there are two keywords that you need to put in your answer. Then apart from that, whatever explanation you write, you will get your full marks. The first one is it is a permanent address. This is the first keyword. Let me underline it. That is used to uniquely identify. Now, uniquely identify is the second keyword, a device or a piece of hardware on the internet. These two are the keywords. You must include these two in your answer, no matter whatever you write. It consists of 48 bits. It is written in six groups of 8 bits each in hexadecimal, like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. MAC address is always written in form of 6 groups having 2 digits each, and the total memory size for this is 48 bits. As you know, One character in hexa is represented by 4 bits. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 characters in hexa would be stored in 48 bits. First half of a MAC address identifies the manufacturer. This is supposed to be The first half is supposed to be manufacturer's code. Again, examiner sometimes ask does the first 6 digit or first half of MAC address represent, and what does the last half or the second half represents. So you need to know that this first half of a MAC address represents manufacturer code, whereas the second half represents the serial number of a device. Now, let's suppose we have a manufacturer which is very famous, that is Dell. All of the devices that Dell would be making would have the same first 6 digit because they are all created by Dell. So the manufacturer address would be same. Whereas the serial number for each device would be different. This much information was there in the old syllabus as well. Now in the new syllabus they have added types of MAC as well. There are two types of MAC addresses: universally administrated MAC addresses, which are commonly known as UAA. They are set by the manufacturing factory or the manufacturer, and this address is almost never changed. It is permanent and it is embedded into the hardware. The next type of address is a locally administrated MAC address or an LAA. Now, what is an LAA? A locally administrated address is assigned to a device by a network administrator, overriding the burnt-in address or the actual address or the universal address or the permanent address. It is done to bypass a MAC filter on a firewall or to get past certain network restrictions, or if the software on a network mainframe needs all MAC addresses to be in a specific strict format. Sometimes what happens is that we need to change the MAC address of our device. Why? Because the firewall or the security on our network is not allowing us to go ahead. Let's suppose somebody has blocked your MAC address through the firewall settings. Now, in order to access the internet, you'll have to change your MAC address. Or let's suppose an organization such as a big bank has set up a huge network of all of its branches, and it has set up a big mainframe server in order to control all of its operations. Now, the thing is, mainframes usually have very strict rules for setting up a network. Mainframes are very powerful and very big size computers. Sometimes what happens is that, let's suppose all the computers or laptops in a specific branch are all belong to HP, whereas the branch manager wants to add a photocopy machine to their network, and that photocopy machine is made by Canon. Now, obviously, there is going to be a difference of MAC address between a Canon photocopy machine and all of the HP desktops and laptops. Now, in order to add that Canon machine onto the network, the mainframe would want that the Canon machine would have a similar MAC address like the other HP computers on the network. So for doing that, it would assign the Canon machine a temporary MAC address that is in the specified format of the HP machines or the HP laptops or desktops, so that it can add that Canon machine photocopier machine into its list. If the network administrator or the MAC address does not do that, then it would not be able to add Canon machine into the network. So at situations like these, we are forced to issue a temporary local MAC address to a specific machine or a computer, and that is known as a locally administrated MAC address. It is You simply need to remember these 2 points, and that's it. Much of a detail is not needed. Now, the next thing which we have is an IP or Internet Protocol address. What is an IP address? It is a unique but temporary address that identifies a device on the internet or a local network. It is assigned by the router. In essence, basically IP addresses are the identifier that allows information to be sent between devices on a network. They contain location information and make devices accessible for communication. If you need to two or three devices to communicate with each other, you'll have to assign them IP addresses and you'll have to connect them through a router so that they can exchange information with each other. An IP address is a string of numbers separated by periods. IP addresses are expressed as a set of four numbers. For example, 192.158.1.38. Each number in the set can range from 0 to 255. Means IP addresses start from 0.0.0.0 and they can go up to 255.255.255.255. Okay. When a router connects to the internet, it is given a unique public IP address. This is usually supplied by the Internet Services Service Provider or the ISP. No other device on the internet has the same public IP address. When your computer or your cell phone connects to uh, tries to connect to a network or basically the internet, then it sends along its MAC address and the server of the ISP issues it a IP address. Now, whatever IP address you are assigned with, it is unique. It means that at that given moment, that IP address is not being used by any other device on the internet. Okay. Every time you connect to your router or connect to the internet, your IP address changes. That is why it is known as a temporary address. There are two versions of IP address. The previous one was known as IP version 4, and the current one which we are using now more and more is IP version 6. We have developed a new version of IP address because IP4 addresses were limited and almost all of them have been used up. But since every day, every month, the internet users multiply, so we needed another method for assigning IP address. Thus, we developed IP address version 6. Version 4 was based on 32 bits, for example 192.158.1.38, whereas the newer version it consists of 128-bit addresses that take the form of 8 groups of hexa digits. For example, an example is given below. See, 1 group, 2 group, 3 group, 4 group, 5, 6, 7, and 8 groups. It consists of 8 groups of hexadecimal characters, and in each group there are 4 hexadecimal characters. The main advantages of IP version 6 are it removes the risk of IP address collisions, means no two devices would have the probability of having the same IP address, and it has built-in authentication checks, so it makes it more secure, and it allows for more efficient packet routes. Means packets are sent in when packets are using IP or a network is using IP version 6, then packets are sent more efficiently. Now, if we talk about the types of IP address, then there are two types. There are two versions of IP address and there are two types of IP address in the new syllabus. The two versions we have discussed. Now we are going to move on to the two types. The two types are static IP address and dynamic IP address. Now, what is an static IP address? A static IP address is simply an address which does not change. Means we just learned that static IP address that an IP address is a temporary address which keeps on changing. But if you issue an address to a device that would remain constant over the month, over the year, then that is known as static IP address. Once your device is assigned a static IP address, that number typically stays the same until the device is decommissioned, means it is taken off the internet or it is taken offline, it is disconnected from the network, or your network architecture changes. Changing the whole network architecture is something that is very difficult and that is very rare, unless in some specific or some special case. We usually don't go for that. So static IP addresses remain the same for a very long time. They are generally used by servers or other important equipment. They are usually web servers have a static IP address. Whatever website you access, it always have a static IP address. Otherwise, if the web server's IP address would keep on changing, then you'll type in google.com and you'll be taken to the homepage of yahoo.com or some other website. But since you would never want that, you would always, obviously anybody would want that whatever web address you have typed in, you should go to the relevant server. That's why we always give a static IP address to the web servers. Now, dynamic IP addresses are subject to change, sometimes at a moment's notice. They keep on changing. They can change 100 times in a day. They may change every hour or they may change every day, but they keep on changing. They are assigned as needed by the dynamic host configuration protocol. Now, dynamic IP address is usually the IP address that is issued to the users when they try to connect to the internet. That is why their IP address is temporary and it keeps on changing. Whereas static IP address is only issued to web servers or server on a network so that they can remain constant and watch over and can be accessed by the other members of the network. We use dynamic addresses because IP version 4 doesn't provide enough static IP addresses to go around. This is another reason why users are not given a static IP address, because in IP version 4, which is the traditional IP address version, it doesn't have room for a lot of static IP address. So, for example, a hotel probably has a static IP address, but each individual device within its room would have a dynamic IP address. The overall IP address of the hotel would be the same. That is also known as the subnet mask. Whereas in each room, every device would have a different public IP address or a dynamic IP address. Now let's have a look of how these two work. Now let's suppose you're here on a browser. You are using a browser and you type in www.facebook.com. Your request is sent to a DNS server, domain name server. The domain name server, what it does, it looks up that, okay, what is the IP, it resolves the domain. Domain resolving is a process in which a DNS server uh, searches the domain name in its database and replies or sends back the user the static IP address of the web server. Okay, these files, the files for this web address facebook.com is stored at this location. Here is the permanent or the static IP address of the web server. The browser then makes a request to that IP address and the web server responds by sending the web files or the web pages of that website to the browser and the browser opens them. This is how a static IP address works. A dynamic IP address, on the other hand, how it works, that first of all, let's suppose this is a user or the workstation. And first of all, when you try to connect to a network, what it would do, the workstation is going to send a request to the DHCP server, which we just learned that it is supposed to be dynamic host configuration protocol server, and it is a server on a network that basically distributes or assigns a temporary IP address to the workstation or the user in response to the request. When you try to connect to a network, then your device makes a request to the server or the router that I want to connect to the internet, please assign me an IP address. So the server in response or the router in response then gives you an IP address. Okay, you may use this IP address to connect to the internet. The workstation then connects to then is able to access the internet, and the workstation can the user, once the connection has been made to the internet, the workstation or the user can then type in the web address, and the web address is then the web address then goes to our DNS server. The DNS server replies with the static IP address of that website. The user then is then redirected to that server using the IP address given to it by the DNS server, and the web server then sends back the web files or the homepage file, the address of the file for homepage of that website back to this IP address, which currently belongs to this user or the workstation. And this is how dynamic IP address works along with your DNS network or static IP. This diagram basically collaborates both the use of static IP address and dynamic IP address. Now the last part of this section or subsection is routers. We have already discussed this before as well, but a router is basically a device that connects two or more packet switching network or subnetworks. Basically, a router connects two or more than two networks together so they may exchange information with each other. Or in broader terms, a router allows a user to connect to the internet. The router has two primary functions: managing the traffic between these networks by forwarding and receiving data packets and distributing IP addresses, and allowing multiple devices to use the same internet connection. There are several types of routers depending on their usage, depending on their area of coverage, or how many devices can they connect, or how many networks can they connect together at a single time. But that is not a part of our syllabus, so you just need to know that there can be many types of routers. A WAN, wide area network, or a internet often contains multiple routers that are connected together. Broadband routers, and these days we have another thing that is known as a broadband router. What is that? A broadband router, like you go to White Tribe or PTCL and you buy their device, so they are going to show you a personal router which you can keep it in your home, and then you can connect your PC or laptop with it in order to access the internet. That is known as a broadband router. It sits behind a firewall, means a broadband router sits behind a strong firewall which protects the computers on a network. Its main function is to transmit internet and protocols between two networks and to allow private networks to be connected together. Means its basic function is to enable the user to uh, connect the internet through a complex network of firewall and through a complex network of ISP servers, Internet Service Provider Company servers. Routers inspect each data packet sent to it from any computer on any of the networks connected to it. They can be wired or wireless devices. Thank you. This is all which you need to know. I hope you have understood everything. Feel free to contact me if you have any problem. Take care. Allah Hafiz.